Hi, and welcome to an episode of the JetRails podcast. I'm Robert Rand, your host. Today, I'm joined from Mark from Natal Eco, who's going to be chatting about the future for Magento 1 users. As we've touched on in some earlier podcast episodes, Magento 1 is reaching its end of life, and there are many businesses that have invested into Magento 1 sites that have not yet made any plan or taken any action to leave Magento 1. And with that in mind, we know that many of those businesses will still wind up on Magento 1 for some length of time after end of life. So we're going to be speaking about what that is going to look like, how to best navigate those waters. And with no further ado, Mark, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Mark Lewis, CEO and founder of Natal Eco Commerce, which we're a Magento, Shopify, and BigCommerce e-commerce agency.
And one of my famous questions that I love to ask, how did Natal Eco get its name?
I think about 8 years ago, I was trying to find a domain name that wasn't already registered, and it's like kind of a single word. So basically, I made up a word. I figured like Samsung, Sony, it's just a thing. So I was like net, and then started like trying Latin endings, and ended up with Natal Eco. And I was like, okay, that's available. And for a while, Google like suggested whenever people would Google it, and was like, did you mean Metallica? Now I think I've solidified it as like a real word, and now it's like, okay, you don't mean Metallica.
Now, the funny thing is that I was sending a text message to someone earlier and mentioning that I was going to be taping with you, and voice to text still does think that you're Metallica. So
that's not a totally bad thing. I mean, I do like some heavy metal music, so that's okay.
Very cool. And I know that one of the unique things about Natal Eco is that your team is distributed, that everyone is, if I understand correctly, is remote, much like myself. As the remote guy for JetRails, I certainly have an affinity for folks that appreciate the style of work. What's your experience been in operating a distributed, remote team, especially given what you work on, these projects that may involve multiple members of your team?
Yeah. So I had a little bit of I would say training working remotely. My last job before starting Natal Eco was for NASA as like an enterprise IT consultant, where we had like 15 different locations all across the world. And from that experience, I realized that there was a lot of value in not being at one of the centers. Obviously, actually, most people, that work for a company work in the office. But when you're trying to operate like in an enterprise level, it's really great to kind of be above it all, because when you're actually in an office, people can just walk up to you and just interrupt you. And honestly, that's the people that interrupt you in person isn't necessarily like the most important thing at that moment. And so that kind of transitioned into starting a company on the same kind of principles, where particularly we work with clients from all over the world. And so there's a lot of value in being in kind of different time zones to kind of get a bit more distribution across, hours, working hours. And, it's nice to not have to get like pulled in different directions, or at least like can be able to control that. Like you probably know, you can put Slack on do not disturb. Sometimes you like really need to concentrate, and it's a lot better being able to do that. And to that end too, we've really tried to create a culture of working asynchronously, and what I mean by that is like don't message someone unless it's like urgent and expect like an answer right then. Because particularly for the developers, designers, people that might get into like a flow state, they're really concentrating. And, even if the answer to that question might be like 30 seconds long, you've disrupted them, and, they might take 15 minutes to get back into that.
Absolutely. It's like trying to write a book and, stopping every 5 minutes. It's very hard to keep the train of thought, and really go where you're trying to go with it. I've been remote for over 2 years now, and I'd done a little bit of remote work before, but having gone from, being in the heart of an on-site agency and circling the office, checking on people, identifying blockers, and, just constantly, in meetings and having people drop in. I would stay until all hours of the night because it was the only time I could get contracts done or authoring content or, real strategy stuff where I needed to dive in, real heavy analytics work. And, for me, it's been a blessing being able to have that experience. And I will say sometimes I forget, to unsilence Slack or things like that because I'm just in such a groove that you can really get a lot done. I love getting to go up to the JetRails office throughout the year and spend time with coworkers, but there's that other side of the coin where I definitely feel lucky that I can pack so much into the day. I feel like it's really, really productive. I do know people that remote work does not work that way for better or worse. And if I saw correctly on your site, you're actually tracking how many pets you've got working in your, I'll call it, satellite offices.
Correct.
Air quotes. Yeah.
We're up to 8 pets, including dogs, cats, horses. And in our satellite offices, we consider the pets kind of part of the coworker because that's the only coworker we have in the office, that day. And, if anyone has ever worked from home with a pet, you realize, like, particularly a cat or something, will be on you. I'm surprised my cats aren't over here right now. Like, they might make an appearance at some point when they get hungry.
So it's always bring your pet to work day.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And so you mentioned you've got clients around the globe. What does your client base look like? Are they, particular verticals or particular sizes that you specialize in? Is it, just a smattering of a little bit of everything?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit of everything. We tend to specialize in, I would say, the mid-market. We've worked with Fortune 500 companies before, and those are really great, big opportunities, but we're kind of a specialized boutique team, and we're not scaling up and down for like big projects and, suddenly doing like 1,000 hours in a month and then nothing in the next month. And so we typically work with clients in the $1 to $10 million range in revenue. And on Magento 1, Magento 2, Shopify, and a little big commerce. And it really depends on the client. It's not a particular vertical. We're more looking for clients that really like want to kind of be integrated with the team and like work collaboratively, as opposed to, particularly a lot of bigger clients like just want to kind of throw things, on an agency. And that's great for big agencies. But we're looking kind of to really be efficient and really be like a part of their team, kind of a fractional CTO, fractional UX designer, as opposed to, like multiple people working on, like multiple developers, multiple designers. Most of our clients do, in the range of like 10 to 50 hours a month. And that's not a full-time person. And if they hired a full-time developer, that, they would have way too much free time, and they want to have like the design assets and SEO. So we're trying to really get that, be like that fractional part of their team.
Yeah, it's interesting. With JetRails, there's some similarity in that we're almost or maybe we are your outsourced sysops that, for those big Fortune 500 style companies, that they'll get to a point where they've got in-house, hosting expertise round the clock, that they're large enough to justify certain expense. We're typically working with, established businesses, mid-market, small, medium enterprise. There's a certain size where they might bring us in, and we have clients of that nature, of those large enterprises, where we'll be there for some ongoing consulting. We'll be there to supplement the knowledge that they have in-house, because we work on so many accounts and with so many new and, in some cases, maybe even beta tools, early release things that, that we have opportunities to compare and contrast with what they're up to. But by and large, we're all looking for folks that we can partner well with, that we can supplement well with the resources that we have on hand, where we can have that positive impact. And, based upon that size that you were mentioning, in the average 1 to 10 million a year in revenue, is it fair to say that a large portion of those users are still on Magento 1?
Definitely. We're seeing in our client base around like 70%. And that kind of almost tracks with what we're seeing on just the general statistics on the web. Maybe like 60% is what most hosting companies are telling me about. They still have a pretty substantial number of clients on Magento 1.
Mm-hmm. And what are your customers telling you about why they're still on Magento 1? I'm sure that your team has had outreach, in your communications. You ask them if they have an interest in anything else, or I'd imagine that the conversation, one way or another, comes up. They're being bombarded with messaging, maybe not unlike this podcast episode about Magento 1's end of life. Mm-hmm. What type of feedback on average are you getting?
Yeah, the conversation has really been evolving ever since Magento 2 was released. When Magento 2 was first released, it seemed like kind of the obvious choice of like, oh, you're on Magento 1, 1.9, just go to 2. But I think merchants realized when they started getting like estimates on the migrations from Magento 1 to Magento 2, they realized like it's not a migration. It's actually a total replatforming project. And so at that point, the conversation changes a little bit, and they start thinking like, well, if I'm going to do this big replatforming, Magento 2 isn't necessarily the obvious choice, because it's really, from like the development standpoint, it's not easier or necessarily harder to go from like Magento 1 to 2 or Magento 1 to Shopify, BigCommerce.
And I would say, if you're doing $1 million in revenue a year and you're not considering what your other options are, I think that, just basic maintenance on a Magento site, patching and upgrading and various other needs, I think that you should be looking at your options. And in some cases, you'll be driven right back to Magento because of the open nature, the flexibility, because of, specific needs and requirements that you have, but you may, very well wind up somewhere else. And, I think the businesses owe it to themselves to investigate that, perhaps to be talking with agencies like yours that specialize in more than one platform that can guide them in a more reasonable way.
Yeah. Like particularly, like you said, it's not the obvious choice. And, like for a lot of the smaller retailers, like Magento 2 does, in addition to the higher like cost of migration, there seems to be a overall higher total cost of ownership because of the frequent patches. The platform is just a bit more complex. It's very robust. It's very powerful. If you can run $1 billion brands on it. But it's kind of like having like a diesel truck or a Ford F-150 when you're trying to just like go highway driving. It's like you're really expending a lot of gas and a lot of money in this analogy to keep something, to keep this power going that you might not need. You can have like a Honda Civic or something.
Yeah. And I think some of it depends on, if you want to own the site, if you want the flexibility Magento brings, if you're interested in some of the cutting edge additions that are being added in. I was just looking, Magento just launched their latest patches and upgrades for both Magento 1 and 2. We've got an article launching. I'm sure I'll wind up adding it in the show notes because it's interesting that, if you were to look, there might have been, in the double digits of fixes and security updates and what have you for Magento 1 in the latest upgrades and patches, but into the triple digits for Magento 2, that there's just, a lot more code being committed, whether it's new features and integrations, whether it's fixes, whether it's, other iterative improvements that it reminds me of when Magento 1 was a little bit younger. And the difference is that when Magento 1 was younger, there weren't quite as many security patches by volume, at least to my memory. Right. It wasn't, under the same climate, which could be said of other platforms that are open source. I wouldn't call that necessarily a Magento problem. I think that, when you're on a platform that's very popular, folks are looking for ways to, to go after, those kinds of sites, look for vulnerabilities that they can find in a wide range of different websites all at once. You've got to be vigilant. And with that, there's a cost to vigilance. You get your freedom of the site, but like we say, that there's more complexity, there's more cost. And keep kind of transitioning from there for a second, would it be fair to say that some of the merchants that you're in contact with, that they have some misconceptions about the end of life of Magento 1? Because it's something that I still run into. And, given that there have been end of life dates for Magento 1, it had moved already, but, they'd extended the end of life, but this is not a new topic. Are you still running into some of that where merchants just aren't sure about what's going to happen in June of 2020, what their options are, what the landscape looks like?
Yeah, definitely. I think the general consensus or just emotion is kind of fear and uncertainty. And a lot of merchants feel like, end of life, all right, maybe their store's just going to shut off. And as you and I know, Magento being an open source product, and if, for example, it being hosted on JetRails servers, nothing is going to change unless the server shuts off. The site will keep on running totally fine, kind of on that drop dead end of life date.
That's right. And there may very well be some web hosts that don't want to support a platform that's not getting official security patches, that provide some sort of notice to their users that they're going to stop supporting, or providing hosting for that platform. Mm-hmm. JetRails is taking the opposite approach, that we're putting things in place in order to better secure our customers that are still on Magento 1 for a period of time, to give them that extra runway to allow it to be their choice. And so and that's certainly a bigger topic, but I think it's an important one. We know that we're certainly not the only Magento web host that's taking steps to be able to continue to support Magento 1 users. I think everyone's approach is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. At JetRails, we're used to tailoring to the user and giving options and working closely in a partner capacity. So that's what we plan to continue to do, not to tie anyone's hands or try to make it something more of a SaaS solution, but rather to empower users to make good choices, to use the technology that they have. And we are still seeing that absolutely, people are afraid that it's like a Y2K, that their site's going to implode. They may have some additional risk. They may have to do certain things or have certain implications least from where we're sitting for PCI compliance in terms of questionnaires and certifications and things. I wouldn't call it a one and done that nothing happens come, June 2020. But at the same time, the site doesn't just break instantly, at least from everything that's available, knowledge-wise today.
Yeah, for sure. It's just the reality is in June, everyone's sites will keep working just fine. What some considerations will be is, after that point, Magento says that they're not releasing patches, and that's pretty much like decided. I haven't heard any wavering on that. And so merchants should be concerned of okay, how do I secure my site? And with that, particularly for PCI compliance, in addition to the patches, there's just so many other ways to secure a website. And honestly, not to get too technical, but a lot of the soupy patches patch things that are fairly low priority. There's something called privilege escalation, where you already have to have admin access. And so maybe you have admin access and you only have access to the CMS, but you could get access to the products. That is a security vulnerability, but it's not
critical. Yeah.
Right. It's not something if you don't patch it, you're just gonna have a wide open hole to get hacked. And for that kind of thing, I recommend more firewalls, particularly, and I think JetRails includes CloudFlare, which we love CloudFlare as in terms of firewall. They have so many automated things where maybe there will be some sort of serious security vulnerability in the software itself, but they've already blocked it at the firewall level. So you should patch it, but you don't have as much urgency around that.
Yeah, and for sure. I mean, CloudFlare is our go-to. It's our standard CDN and WAF. For virtual firewalling. It's phenomenal. We've been significant partners of CloudFlare for years. We've written the Magento extensions for Magento 1 and Magento 2 to integrate CloudFlare more cohesively into your Magento admin so that you can do things like flush cache without needing to open up another browser window and go directly to a CloudFlare portal. You can do it from your Magento admin. We like making these tools simpler to use, better to use. For our customers, we're managing those firewalls for them, additional blacklists and things that we've got going. But we've also partnered with others like Sucuri. So if we've got a client that would rather use that firewall, for instance, and Sucuri has their own standards and their own benefits, especially around Magento 1 end of life, that we've got choice for users and we can help users navigate those waters as part of the bigger, the bigger look at it, that you want to be following other general best practices, things around least privileged access in terms of how anyone can potentially get to your web server, or what information about your web server is being leaked out. and people don't, the outside world doesn't need to know what versions of certain software you're running and other things that, outside of the end of life of Magento 1, I'm always amazed how many people are still on a version of PHP that's end of life when they could have had that upgraded. So, and for the same, same line of thinking, how many are still missing Magento 1 patches and operating on Magento 1? So typically, I think, if you want to stay on Magento 1, you really do want to have the right dev partner, the right agency that's helping to make sure that that your Magento instance is healthy, the right hosting partner to make sure that the hosting environment is healthy. I mean, we do free security audits and speed tests and things, as well as different, paid offerings as well. But, we always tell people, go to our site, fill out the little security form. We'll give you insight. There are things that you can just patch or deal with wherever you are, but you should know what's visible to pretty much any hacker that goes and takes a look at your site or that's scanning Magento sites randomly across the internet. And you should be dealing with those things. Now, back to Magento patches. I know that there are some initiatives that are putting, or at least promising, to put out some Magento patches for M1 post end of life. So from the community or from a particular company that may charge some money. Is that something that you've had a chance to really dive in with?
Yeah. Right now there are 3 kind of prominent, I would say, like forks or projects to maintain Magento after the end of life. The first one is OpenMage, which has been around, I think, over a year, and they've actually already been basically fixing bugs in Magento 1 as in terms of like indexing issues or something like that. And they've been integrating all the security patches that Magento corporate is releasing, but they're trying to like actually make Magento 1 better. And they also have like a roadmap of, basically maintaining Magento 1 kind of as is with bug fixes and security, and then kind of actually evolving it and, doing more like headless and PWA. Like OpenMage really wants to make Magento 1 kind of live forever. The other project is Mage 1, which is the concept of it is like you pay a monthly fee and they will release security patches, kind of like almost like Magento Enterprise Edition. I've had some conversations with Mage 1, and I'm also involved with OpenMage as a part of their kind of like contributors. Mage 1, they really have to get a lot of merchants subscribed, or it won't really be worth it for them to maintain it. Because basically, if they release or fix a patch, in Magento 1, that's just one piece of work. And if they don't have enough merchants to kind of make that worth their while, the project could kind of go belly up. It could be more expensive than they're actually making. And I've had a lot of conversations with them around that. And additionally, there's some licensing issues where they're proposing to keep the patches private, but Magento is under a particular open source license where that's a little of a gray area, basically.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And it is interesting. I'd been taking a look earlier at some of the documentation around OpenMage. And if I remember correctly, they've already closed something like 400 plus issues on GitHub. Yeah. I know that I was looking over an older article that I'd seen in the past from Magento, where in 2018 they already had 68 code contributors and and lots of momentum. I don't know that OpenMage has really grown additional momentum maybe from those earlier days, but they at least seem to be going. I'm with you. I don't know that that my goal in life would be to keep Magento 1 running forever. I think like any aged piece of software that it should it should enjoy a retirement at some point. I don't think that we all want to go back to Windows 3.1 or I don't pick your poison, right?
Well, Windows XP.
That's fair. There's still some ETMs and stuff running Windows XP, right?
It's true.
Yeah, we wish that wasn't the case, but it is. So it lives, but it's not really it's not really where you want to be if you're trying to run a cutting edge business.
Right.
Yeah. So that's going to be I think one of the biggest questions is, if you do get some patches, how does that go? And side by side with that, what about the Magento extensions? Because if the Magento extension developers aren't providing patches for those, and if the Magento patches that are being put out by, let's say, OpenMage don't necessarily take into account some of those common Magento extensions, and and nobody's really watching those, are those going to continue to be a sore spot? We do know that from time to time, some of the vulnerabilities that come up with Magento, they are extension based, as opposed to the core product.
Yeah, well, to that end, I don't think there's been like a serious 0-day vulnerability in the Magento 1 core in over 3 to maybe even 5 years. I think the last serious bug was the shoplift bug, where basically if you weren't patched, you could just get hacked, just like that. And with that, I've observed some confusion around the Magento security itself, because I think that just applying the patches is almost like TSA level security.
Security theater, yeah, I like that.
Right, yeah, it's about PCI compliance. That you need to look secure, but if you're not caring about the third-party extensions that you have installed and the possible vulnerabilities in that, it doesn't matter whether you have the latest SUPI, because any module can have some sort of backdoor, whether accidental, or some modules do have backdoors programmed into them. Particularly encrypted modules.
PCI compliance is obviously very important, but I would agree that it is, to an extent, it's a test. It's standardized, and that means that it isn't necessarily, the scans that you run, the tests that happen, they're not built to test for every vulnerability or for things that are particularly specific to your website. Yes, they're going to check that certain ports are locked down and that other best practices are there. They'll also catch a bunch of a bunch of red flags that are false flags because yes, something might be accessible, but it's blocked off in another way where it's not really vulnerable to some sort of an attack. So yeah, it's interesting. So I know that I typically recommend that people they go through, they see what extensions they have, they remove things that they're not using or that are obsolete, or I was using the term on a recent episode, talking a little bit about is this extension bringing you joy?
Mm-hmm.
The modern outlook on things. Is this bringing you value? At the risk of being redundant. And so I think that that's certainly going to be important, as it always has been, because it's not even just the security, but you're also potentially adding more code conflict into the mix by adding all these extras. You're potentially slowing down your site, adding code that can have an issue, that can cause the site to take longer to load various pages or elements. So it's always a best practice that few stop to actually go through and clean up.
Yeah. There's William DeGroot, he's a fairly well-known security researcher in the Magento space.
Actually, use some of the tools that his team puts out. So yeah, very familiar.
Say Sanguine Security, his scanner is amazing, and he also has a list basically of third-party modules and the versions that are vulnerable. The scanner that he has basically automatically uses that list and looks for other infections. But if you can't afford the scanner, or your host doesn't have the scanner, like JetRails, you can just look at that list and say, oh, I have a vulnerable module. And if you have a vulnerable module, it's really just a matter of time, before you potentially get hacked. And once again, it doesn't matter how many SUPI patches you have at that point. You'd have kind of an open door right there.
Yeah. And, this is one of the benefits of working with folks that do a volume of the work, whether it's with a host that is using different tools to your benefit, that's more proactive, that, this is the lifeblood, or whether it's development. I mean, if you're going from Magento 1 to 2 and you've never done it before, not only is there a learning curve, but there are scripts and things that if you've done any volume of this, that you have in your back pocket that help with some of that process. So that's certainly, I think, a consideration for folks, regardless of what vendors they use, just, making sure that they're talking to folks that understand best practice and that have resource available.
And I think to that end, I think the web hosts like JetRails, the Magento specialized web hosts are in the best position to really support Magento 1 merchants, because they have that kind of knowledge base of the security and vulnerabilities. Whereas if you just slap your site on GoDaddy, they're basically just going to tell you if your server's down or not down. When you're working with a Magento specialized host, they know the actual application, and they know what to do to secure that application.
We know what best practices for scalability, security, for speed, for general stability and reliability of the site. We're picking up the phone within 10 seconds for anything and everything. We're proactively monitoring. We have an operations center in NOC where we're monitoring these sites 24/7. So when there is an issue, we typically know first whether it's a DDoS attack or whether it's maybe some code that got committed that didn't work out quite as well as one would hope. And so we get to work on immediate mitigation, notify everyone involved. It's a different animal when you're relying on this website to put food on the table. When this is your lifeblood, and this is a serious part of of your existence, absolutely. And like I say, we're not the only strong Magento host in town. We like to think that we have some differentiators and some unique things that we bring to the table. We're always happy to have those conversations with merchants, but it's more about the ability to invest time and resource into understanding Magento, into properly optimizing environments from all perspectives, including security for Magento. And the same would apply to other platforms, of course. So same thing that I would tell people about hiring an agency is that there's lots of folks that know HTML and CSS or PHP or JavaScript or whatever it may be. But if you aren't familiar enough with Magento as a platform, there's a steep learning curve. There's a pound of flesh to pay.
Definitely. And that's one thing to consider. And moving away from Magento 1 is that over time, the agency support will get worse because there's not a huge incentive to keep that Magento 1 knowledge for forever. So
I don't know a lot of developers, and this is, I think, a linchpin for this, that want to continue to focus on Magento 1, that for their careers, they know that that's eventually, whether or not it continues to live on for a bit longer, it's going to head to the graveyard. It's not exciting in terms of learning new things and growing your skills, which is something that I think, developers are prone to, that they're people that naturally, in many cases, have that bug that they want to be learning and growing, but more so for a job safety perspective, that you want to chase the new thing, the thing that's more challenging, and not just get stuck in your old skill set that'll eventually become obsolete. So I think that for those reasons as well, it is questionable. I mean, I think that there are still plenty of developers today, but I think that there is a dissipation, at least of the really good developers. Let's put it that way, that if you're really good at what you do, you're going to want to stay at the top of your game.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's one differentiation between my agency, Natal Eco, is most of our staff have worked at a merchant. And I think we have a whole lot of empathy for the position merchants are in right now. Even I'm a developer myself, even if I really would love to use Knockout.js and, the latest frameworks, being in the trenches with these merchants for years and years, I realized that while Magento 2 or Magento 1 might not be like the sexiest platform right now, it's definitely seeing its wrinkles right now.
But it's stable.
It's very stable, and a lot of merchants have built their platform on top of the foundation of Magento 1. And I think that's something that's often neglected when Magento corporate and just agencies in general be like, oh, Magento 2 has all these great features. Well, a lot of merchants just don't care because they've customized Magento 1 to exactly what they need it to do already. And I've seen some cases of kind of Magento 1 to Magento 2 rescue projects where they got to Magento 2 quickly because they felt like, they're being pushed off of it. And then they realized and felt like, oh, did we get downgraded? Like 2 is greater than 1, but our site is slower. It doesn't do some things that our old site did because they had so many customizations. It was like a custom card. It's just
absolutely, not enough scoping to understand what really getting a one-to-one move where you would, because if you were on Magento 1 for pick your length of time, whether it was 3 years or 5 years or 8 years, or you had years and years of installing extensions and having customization done, and you've forgotten a good chunk of it as a business owner. Until you really go back, and you probably have very limited documentation on what was done. That seems to be consistent. Years of different employees of different developers and agencies. So going back and having a quick audit done to see what extensions are in there and understand what you actually have and what it's going to take to get something equal. Get something that's going to perform in a similar way with M2. And Magento 2, Magento 1 was a resource hog. Magento 2 is certainly a beast. It is not exactly the same. You may have to optimize more. You may need, your hosting to be a little bit different. You may certainly want to take advantage of additional caching like Varnish that you may have gotten away with using something lesser with Magento 1. It is different. And so I would say that there is definitely some of that in the market, that it's just about having the right Sherpas to get you up the mountain to understand what it's really going to cost you, how long it's really going to take. In some cases, I don't want to overstep, but it may not be that hard or take that long. But you want to know the first time. You don't want to find out in arrears that your original scope was incorrect, was a fraction of the real job. Just like any other project that you'll come across, I find that's all part and parcel of the industry as a whole. And even then, you may find that your favorite Magento 1 extension isn't available for Magento 2, and then you've got to do some serious thinking about, do you have a custom extension written, or do you use something else that's similar enough? It's not always an apples to apples, one-to-one. There are, I think compromise is part of the process. And in some cases, it's about figuring out also what are the new features of Magento 2. We've spent some time on the podcast and put out some material on the topic as well. Because Magento 2 launched in 2015, and now we're several iterations in. And I think that for a lot of merchants, they don't even know what's there. And like a lot of software, most of us don't use every feature in Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel.
Right.
There's a lot that goes unused. Some of those things that are going to be impactful, some of them not as much. It's the same thing I tell people when they're looking at Magento open source versus Magento Commerce, that it has to do with, what's the actual feature list? What are you going to use? And dollar for dollar, would you be better off with using some extensions or SaaS solutions to get those features and have more money left for marketing? Are you going to use so much of it that absolutely the commerce starts to become an easy win, and dollar for dollar, it makes sense? There's math to be done. And it's rare that you see that someone sit down with a spreadsheet and do the math. It's usually, oh, you've got this much revenue, so we're just going to tell you that this is the answer, or that's the answer.
I could do a whole nother podcast on that topic.
Yeah. You know, I'm for all of it. You know, I think there's a user for all of it. There's a use case for all of it. But, you know, I asked a question earlier and I didn't think about it, but about misconceptions about the end of life of Magento 1. And one that we came across was merchants that were being told by folks in the ecosystem from places that we wouldn't have expected, telling them that Magento Community didn't exist and that they should go Magento Commerce. Instead of saying that it was basically, well, there's only Magento Open Source, it's not called Community anymore, they were sort of sidestepping that a little bit to people that knew better. And it was a bit awkward to have some of those conversations. But there's a lot of that salesmanship going on in, I'd say, the last year or so. And we're trying to help our clients and our folks that we're in touch with to at least navigate the waters in real terms. As a web host, we don't, whether you're on open source or commerce, we're happy to host you. It doesn't, doesn't change all that much for us, but it's very interesting what's going on out there. And, with Magento 2.3, support for progressive web apps for PWA, a lot of the GraphQL APIs and things have been stealing a lot of the limelight, whether or not they're the most used or not. There's a lot of potential there, and some cutting edge brands getting a lot of value out of that new tech. I know that there are some that have started, even with Magento 1, to use similar, progressive web app opportunities to replace their front end, to do things, from a security perspective. I suppose that may take away some vulnerability of anything that may happen in your traditional Magento 1 front end, because you're not loading the traditional front end, you're loading this progressive web app. Have you come across that as part of anyone's strategy to stay on Magento 1, to extend the life of it, to make the portion that's really accessible to the outside world something different than the native front end?
I think the PWA stuff is interesting for Magento 1 and 2, but I would only recommend that unless you're really considering that kind of PWA front end. I don't think it's particularly a great security fix, because you still have to expose at least part of your backend or the front end to access it. But in general, however much you can really lock down your site, and if your backend only has access to the APIs, you're not having all these random URLs and stuff. That is a net win. It's just not something that I would recommend people rely on or go that way for security reasons. Mostly it's performance and SEO, that kind of thing.
That makes sense. What else should Magento 1 users be thinking about moving forward? And I'd say especially around third parties, because we've been talking a lot about Magento's core and about developers and hosts, but there's a lot of extensions and integrations out there as well.
Yeah, I think that will be one of the biggest blockers or motivations for people to switch to Magento 2 or another platform, as extension vendors and just various integrations payment gateways like Authorizenet, or I think Adyen is one of a UK payment vendor that says we're not going to support Magento 1 period in June.
I think that their statement had to do with PCI compliance, that they didn't particularly want to be part of a solution that wasn't going to be PCI compliant. They didn't want to put their rubber stamp on it. So I think that I don't know if anything's changed, but I know I'd included it in an article over the last few months that they were basically saying don't plan on getting continued support from Adyen if you're staying on Magento 1 after its end of life. Authorize.net's an interesting one, because with this week's latest releases from Magento, they've begun deprecating Authorize.net from the Magento core in the first place. basically telling folks that with some new EU policies, which I think are good, for the record, that that their core integration to Authorize.net as well as some others were not we're not compatible, we're not satisfactory for the new standards. Yeah. And so go to the Magento marketplace and get an extension there. But in essence, they're not going to be putting out an update in the core. We've certainly seen through the years where a native Magento module, if you will, let's say UPS, needs an update. And I suppose, that at that point, you're going to be relying at best on, someone like OpenMage or some other third party to navigate those waters for you, unless you're going to take on that expense yourself to go and fix whenever there's a change in some third party's API or some other service or integration that, whether it's native or whether it's not.
There's also a lot of SaaS services like ShipperHQ, and one of the values of something like ShipperHQ is they really abstract all those different APIs, UPS, FedEx. I'm just talking about shipping that applies
absolutely
to everything else, like payment gateways. And if you have some sort of SaaS solution just plugging in and filling that gap, you don't have to worry about every individual thing. And I'm seeing that a bit with payment gateways as well. Authorize.net, I think, is an interesting one because it was kind of like the standard payment integration for a while, because so many merchant providers supported Authorize.net as kind of like the gateway. But I think, in Magento's case, they kind of, even before they deprecated it, they just stopped caring about it because there wasn't really an incentive for them to maintain it themselves. Magento has a partnership with PayPal and Braintree where they do actually kind of get a little rev share from that. And so they're more incentivized to maintain Braintree and PayPal in the core, and as opposed to Authorize.net. I think it's actually good for the community to kind of take over the maintenance of that kind of thing.
I would agree. And I don't mind some of these things being managed via extension. I think there are fewer conflicts that way. You basically only have what you need, don't have extra weight in the site, for things that you're not using. So I've got, some similar thinking there. Certainly I think PCI compliance is going to continue to be an interesting topic for folks that stay on Magento 1 and if and how they're going to continue to maintain some of those needs. Similarly, I had a question come up earlier today. I was posting a reply to someone that was asking for a particular feature in their Magento 1 site in the Magento forums. Somehow I still find a few minutes to try to pay it forward on there, as best as I can, whatever use I am to the universe, right? And, and I was saying to myself, here you go, here's some links, there are actually extensions to do what you're looking to do. And I started wondering, will those links be any good come June? And with all of those users still on Magento 1, I actually don't know what the official line is from Magento on how long they'll allow Magento 1 extensions to continue to live in the marketplace, or if they'll cut them off at that point. It is going to be a question that I'm going to add to my list for Magento Imagine this year, that I'll hope to get some sort of semblance of answer to. But back to integrations and other things, I'm just finishing up an article that I hope to launch no later than tomorrow. Google's Chrome browser version, I believe it's 80, is launching in about a week. And they've got new policies for same-site cookies. And I'm not going to go too deep into it here and now, but I'm personally expecting some ramifications for some Magento users, whether they're using cookies with third-party integrations that pull up iframes, like maybe some kind of a payment gateway like PayPal, or whether they're whether they've got maybe some software running on the server like New Relic, or whether they're running multiple domains to their Magento instance and they're sharing cookies between. There are some implications here. And so I know that, there's an open issue on GitHub for Magento 2. This is one of those things where I think that there are going to be a number of users that their site doesn't function quite the way that it did for these users in Chrome, and Firefox and others will subsequently take on similar rules. It's security based. It's not a bad thing, but it doesn't really matter which version, or whether you were on WooCommerce or PrestaShop or Xcard, or pick something more, something newer like Silius or Shopware. If you're on an open source platform, I think that you're going to have to address things like that in ongoing. If you're in a supported platform, you may be more likely to get some sort of a patch or update. In the case of Magento 1 or 2, I don't know that there's going to be any relief for that particular issue in the immediate. So it's one that we're going to be trying to, tell people, go test your site as fast as you can now.
Get on Chrome Canary, and see
exactly
how it does.
Have you? I know it's something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. Have you seen anyone looking to test their site for that?
We've definitely heard like some rumblings of it. I haven't come across anything specifically that I know doesn't work, but theoretically, I really can imagine some existing integrations that wouldn't work.
I'm not trying to go doomsday on any of it, but better as a web host. Inevitably, when things stop working, our ticket queue starts to to get some new additions, and so we do try. While we're not, the Magento developers to our clients, or the developers for whatever other platforms some of our other customers may be using, we do certainly like to share information so that the people know in advance, or so we can flag for them what an issue may be, so they can get on it as reasonably as possible. Sometimes folks ask us, why do we get into some of these topics? And we're part of that community. We're part of the ecosystem, and we find that it's important that we participate in that way, just like other web hosts and dev teams and marketers and what have you, that we're all in it together. It takes a village.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of dovetails into an effort that I'm working on called Mage 1 Security Edition, which is trying to kind of collaborate among the different Magento web hosts, particularly Magento web hosts, agencies, and some merchants that have really vested interest, literally financial interest in keeping Magento 1 secure for at least 1 to 2 years while they're working on some sort of other migration. There is a financial interest in keeping Magento 1 secure, and I think that it can be done in a way that kind of benefits the community from an open source perspective. And so I'm working with Mage with OpenMage as well, which they're more thinking about bug fixes, and they'll obviously do security fixes, but I'm trying to create a bug bounty program and keep that open to the community, so that if a vulnerability is found and it's patched, it's open to the community, just like Magento 1 is currently on the community open source edition.
Absolutely. And look, there are lots of us in the community that want to stand behind those kinds of projects, that are involved in some similar things. So definitely, keep us at JetRails in the loop, as you've already begun to, for how we can be supportive. And I really appreciate you coming on, having this chat today. I think a lot of great things for merchants to think about. And any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think this Magento 1 end of life conversation is really complicated, and hopefully this information is good for someone that's really thinking about it. But feel free to shoot me an email if you just have specific questions or concerns. It's well, what about this extension? What about this? Just shoot me an email, mark@nataleco.com.
Awesome. Well, Mark, thank you again for joining. For our listeners, thank you for tuning into another episode. We'll be sure to share some handy links in the description of the podcast episode, and stay tuned for some other great episodes. We've got a good dozen planned already in 2020 and growing. So lots more great content to come. As always, please feel free to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or catch our videos, whether YouTube or Facebook. We're at JetRails, certainly on LinkedIn and Twitter. And feel free to give us a review, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or another podcast platform. We do truly appreciate it. Thanks, and happy selling.